Wishing you as usual a very good morning. I hope that this video will be finding you in a better place and better position, safe and sound during this corona time. So here we are going to start our romantic criticism. The first romantic critic that we are going to deal with here is William Wordsworth. The famous work of William Wordsworth, I've told in the previous class, it was the Lyrical Ballads. It was published in the year 1798, republished later with a preface, and it was published in 1800. And you can see that there was another one work which was very dominant during this period, which was Samuel Taylor Coleridge, who wrote Biographia Literaria in the year 1870. So, as we have studied earlier, as we have known earlier, they were both very good friends. They were very bosom friends. Then they were very obliged to write more about romantic poetry and the way in which poetry can be defined. So here you can see that the Romantic criticism was a breakaway from the past neoclassical critical thoughts. What are the neoclassical critical thoughts? The neoclassical critical thoughts were based upon the idea that everything is based upon the reason and enlightenment and logical thinking. It gave more idea to the intelligentsia or to the brain. But in the case of romantic criticism, you can see that it was the play of heart, not the play of brain. So, through the heart or through the emotions, they began to think. So, William Wordsworth, he said in his most famous critical work, the preface to the Lyrical Ballads, he says that every poetry is good only if it triggers or it fascinates or it emotionally appeals to the senses of the reader. And so, romantic criticism is also known as an impressionist criticism. Okay, you know that Wordsworth was a very poet of nature. He took nature as his guardian. He took nature as his nurse. In his famous poem Tintern Abbey, he says that nature is his guard and nurse. Isn't it? He says about the different aspects that are found in nature. He says about the daffodils. He says about Milton. He says about the time period in which industrial revolution had taken place. He tells about how nature was there all around. He talks of Lucy Gray. Who is Lucy Gray? Lucy Gray is a famous poem by William Wordsworth in which a small girl, she lost her way in a snowy path while she was going searching for her parents. And there you can see that only her footprints remain in the snow. It was a very great poem. It emotionally appealed to the senses of the reader in such a way that the reader always had to shed some tears after reading this particular poem, Lucy Gray. So, going to Wordsworth's criticism, we can go to our Wordsworthian criticism. William Wordsworth, he was born in the year 1770 and he lived up to 1850. He wrote the preface to the Lyrical Ballads in 1800 and again in 1802. So first of all, you have to hear that the preface to the Lyrical Ballads was a rewritten piece of Lyrical Ballads which he wrote in 1798. That is something that I have told you in the earlier class. The romantic criticism begins with 1798, the publication of the Lyrical Ballads. The publication of the Lyrical Ballads gave a new distinction to the criticism which is known as romantic criticism. and it was found in the year 1798. And this piece of lyrical ballads, it was a form, it was a collection of poems, and in this poem you can see Kubla Khan, you can see the rhyme of the ancient mariner, you can see the different poems even of Samuel Taylor Coleridge. Therefore, you can see that it was a joint composition of Coleridge as well as Wordsworth. But after Wordsworth had published his lyrical ballads in 1798, William Wordsworth, he published his lyrical ballads in 1798, and after that you can see that Coleridge broke away from the thoughts that he had shared with William Wordsworth. Coleridge thought that the ideas and the thoughts that are revealed in these lyrical ballads are not proper, and therefore he wrote another one treatise in just opposite to what William Wordsworth has written. So it is almost like ഈ തേപ്പ് എന്നൊക്കെ പറയത്തില്ലേ, അതേപോലത്തെ ഒരു വൻ തേപ്പാണ് കിട്ടിയത് ആർക്ക്, വില്യം വേർഡ്സ്വർത്തിന്. എന്ത് തേപ്പ്? ആദ്യം കൂടെ നിന്ന് ലിറിക്കൽ ബാലൻസ് എഴുതി, അതിനുശേഷം ലിറിക്കൽ ബാലൻസ് പബ്ലിഷ് ചെയ്തതിന് ശേഷം എന്ത് പറ്റി, കോളറിഡ്ജ് പോയിട്ട് ഇതിനെപ്പറ്റി ഇതിൻ്റെ എഗെയിൻസ്റ്റ് ആയിട്ട് തോട്ട്സ് ഒക്കെ എഴുതാൻ തുടങ്ങി. അപ്പോൾ എന്ത് പറ്റി, വേർഡ്സ്വർത്ത് അതിനൊരു പ്രിഫസ് ഉണ്ടാക്കി, ഇതിനെപ്പറ്റി ഇത് റിബൽ ചെയ്ത്, അതായത് ഇത് ഡിഫെൻഡ് ചെയ്ത് അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഇത് സപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്ത്, ഇയാളുടെ ഐഡിയാസ് സപ്പോർട്ട് ചെയ്ത് ഒരു പ്രിഫസ് എഴുതി. ആ പ്രിഫസാണ് 1800 പബ്ലിഷ് ചെയ്തത്. പക്ഷേ അതിനുശേഷം എന്താ പറ്റിയേ, കോളറിഡ്ജിൻ്റെ ഐഡിയാസ് വെച്ചിട്ട് ഉണ്ടാക്കിയ കുറേ കാര്യങ്ങളെല്ലാം കൂടെ ചേർത്ത് കോളറിഡ്ജ് പുതിയൊരു ക്രിറ്റിസിസം അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ഒരു ക്രിട്ടിക്കൽ പീസ് എഴുതി. ആൻഡ് ഇറ്റ് ഈസ് ദ ഫേമസ് വർക്ക് വിച്ച് ഈസ് നോൺ ആസ് ബയോഗ്രഫിയ ലിറ്ററേറിയ. അത് നമ്മൾ നാളെ പഠിക്കും. അപ്പം ബയോഗ്രഫിയ ലിറ്ററേറിയ വാസ് പബ്ലിഷ്ഡ് ഇൻ 1870. ഓക്കെ, ലീവ് ഇറ്റ്. നൗ നമ്മൾ പഠിക്കുന്നത് ലിറിക്കൽ ബാലൻസിനെ പറ്റിയാണ്. And you can see that William Wordsworth had written various other pieces also. Essay on epitaphs, preface to the excursion, preface to the poems. ഇതൊക്കെ വില്യം വേർഡ്സ്വർത്തിൻ്റെ ഓരോ റൈറ്റിംഗ്സ് ആണ്. And preface to the lyrical ballads is defined as the most vital essay of William Wordsworth. Okay. So William Wordsworth's ഏറ്റവും ഇമ്പോർട്ടൻ്റ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള വൈറ്റൽ പീസ് ഓഫ് റൈറ്റിംഗ് ഈസ് വാട്ട്? Preface to Lyrical Ballads. Now we can see that, as I have told you earlier, the French Revolution with its slogan of liberty, equality, fraternity, it fueled or inspired the minds of the people during this period, during the Romantic period. And this, along with the writings of various French writers like Rousseau, Voltaire, etc., the philosophers, etc., and also during the Romantic period you can see that there was always an individuality assertion of individuality was always there. It was asserted mainly by Mary Wollstonecraft. മേരി വുൾസ്റ്റൺക്രാഫ്റ്റ് എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു ലേഡി റൈറ്ററാണ് ആദ്യത്തെ ഫെമിനിസ്റ്റ് റൈറ്റിംഗ് എഴുതുന്നത്. ആൻഡ് ഹെർ വർക്ക് ഇസ് നോൺ ആസ് ദ വിൻഡിക്കേഷൻ ടു ദ റൈറ്റ്സ് ഓഫ് വുമൻ. Okay. And now when you go to William Wordsworth, you can see that the critical observations of William Wordsworth is scattered everywhere. But the preface to Lyrical Ballads is regarded as the most vital among all these works. Okay, and it is regarded as the most authentic expression of romantic movement. So in the first version it had around 7,000 words. Okay, in 1802 another edition it added some 300 words also. So in total 7,300 words. അതാണ് ഈ ഒരു എസ്സേയുടെ പ്രത്യേകത. ഓക്കെ, then Wordsworth's piece of writing is not an organized piece of literary theory, just like what you have studied earlier. You have studied about Sidney, you have studied about Dryden, you have studied about Johnson. All these people had defined certain rules for literary criticism. But in the case of William Wordsworth, you can see that there is no authentic organization of ideas in the literary theory. While Sidney and the neoclassicist critics, they always said about the different connections or how the poem and the poet should have to write. Then in the romantic period you can see that it is always there is a connection between the reader as well as the poet. There is always an impressionistic approach, there is always some impression and an emotional appeal that is found in the poet's writing that is appealed to in the mind of the reader. So you can see that his preface is not perfectly organized as a piece of literary theory. And you can see that the expressions in the neoclassical criticism, everything was said in a straightforward manner. But here in the romantic period there is also a different kind of matter here. The common man is the main center or the epicenter of the ideas here. The common man becomes the center of ideas here. And there is always a sympathy to the common man. Now you can see that Wordsworth speaks as a representative of the common man here. There is always something noble here, and that is what we find in the next slide. Preface to the Lyrical Ballads. It is regarded as the most authentic expression of the ideals of the Romantic movement, and it was written in 1800 and rewritten in 1802. Not perfectly organized as a piece of literary theory, and here William Wordsworth speaks as a representative of the common man for the fellow men. And he declares that the kings and the countrymen who were the subjects of the previous writings are not to be taken into consideration again. He deals with the humanistic aspect, humanism, that is something that he deals with here. So it is always something that is in concomitance or in accordance with the Renaissance period. It is always the renewal of the medieval romances as well as the humanistic approaches that is found here. There is always a certain kind of eye upon the common man. The common man is regarded as the most pertinent element here. The common man becomes the symbol of identity. The common man is the voice of the representative of the whole world. So here you can see that the subject matter of the romantic poetry is that of the common people. Now Wordsworth declares in his Lyrical Ballads. See, this is something that he declares. This is quoted from his preface to Lyrical Ballads. So let us see what it is. The principal object then proposed in these poems was to choose incidents and situations from common life and to relate or describe them throughout as far as was possible in a selection of language really used by men, and at the same time to throw over them a certain colouring of imagination whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect, and further and above all to make these incidents and situations interesting by tracing in them truly, though not ostentatiously, the primary laws of nature, chiefly as far as regards the manner in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. So after reading this, നിങ്ങൾക്ക് മനസ്സിലായി കാണും, the language in which it is written, it is academic. So there is a difference between academic writing and the usual writing. ഒരു ലിറ്ററേച്ചർ പഠിക്കുന്ന ഒരു വ്യക്തി അക്കാഡമിക് റൈറ്റിംഗ് അറിഞ്ഞിരിക്കണം. He should have to know and understand an academic writing. And that is what makes him capable to understand anything. It is not a short story. It is not a poem. It is not an essay or something that you can skip. And that is something that I want to tell my students. The notes that I gave, most of them were saying that it is very difficult to follow the notes. Okay, it will be difficult. Why? Because criticism should be written in academic language. നിങ്ങൾക്ക് പരമാവധി സമയം ഞാൻ തന്നിരുന്നു പഠിക്കാനും എല്ലാം. And that was the time period in which I wanted you to come into the flow of academic writing. പക്ഷെ അക്കാഡമിക് റൈറ്റിംഗ് മനസ്സിലാക്കി എഴുതാൻ ഒരു സാവകാശം നിങ്ങൾക്ക് തന്നിട്ട് പോലും നിങ്ങൾക്കത് ടഫായിട്ട് തോന്നുന്നെങ്കിൽ വേർ ഇസ് ദ ഫ്ലോ, വേർ ഇസ് ദ ഡിഫക്റ്റ്? The notes that I gave you is very simple. It is very straightforward. It is very simple. And people were asking me for more notes. I gave more notes. And if you feel that some people will be thinking that, okay, this is my kind of essay, it is very easy, then you should have to study that. If some people are thinking that another one difficult essay will fetch you more marks, then you can study that also. It is not under my provision that you should have to study this or that, because we are in an online class and therefore you know the limitations. I won't be able to come to your home and I won't be able to discuss and write notes. So it is under your jurisdiction to write and combine notes after hearing my audio lectures. So here Wordsworth in the declaration, he says about the language and the subject of the poetry. He says the object. What is it object? The object എന്ന് വെച്ചാൽ ആ പോയട്രിയുടെ ഒബ്ജക്റ്റ്. പോയട്രിയുടെ ഒബ്ജക്റ്റ് എന്തായിരുന്നു? ടു ചൂസ് ഇൻസിഡൻസ് ആൻഡ് സിറ്റുവേഷൻസ് ഫ്രം കോമൺ ലൈഫ്. ഒരു കോമൺ ലൈഫിൽ കാണുന്ന ഇൻസിഡൻസും സിറ്റുവേഷൻസും ആയിരുന്നു ഒബ്ജക്റ്റായിട്ട് എടുക്കേണ്ടത്, അതായത് സബ്ജക്റ്റ് മാറ്റർ ഓഫ് ദ പോയട്രി. And to relate or describe them throughout as far as possible in the selection of a language. അപ്പം what is it? നമ്മുടെ സിറ്റുവേഷൻ എന്താണ്? സിറ്റുവേഷൻ ഈസ് ദാറ്റ് ഓഫ് ദ കോമൺ ഇൻസിഡൻറ്റ്, and you have to take this common incident that had happened in the life of the common man, and you should have to write it in a language that can be understood, and that is the language of the common man. Then at the same time to throw over them a certain coloring of imagination. Okay, certain coloring of imagination. You take an incident and you are just saying, okay, I've seen if I was a person who was in degree and I saw a bunch of golden daffodils moving their head in a garden, I would say I saw a bunch of daffodils there. They were there glowing, or they were there blooming, isn't it? But in the case of Wordsworth, when he wrote his Daffodils, the poem, what did he say? I saw a fetch of daffodils, a bunch of daffodils. They were shimmering and shivering their heads, and they were joyously blooming there. But I am not a romantic poet. Therefore, I won't be able to write in such a language. So what he says is that every incident should be written in a language of the common man, and that incident should be colored with the imagination of the poet, whereby ordinary things should be presented to the mind in an unusual aspect. There should be an unusual aspect. So whatever we are seeing, even if it is of a നമ്മുടെ വീട്ടിലുള്ള ഒരു പിന്നെ പുല്ലിനെ പറ്റി എഴുതിയാലും you should have to make it strange to the reader. നമുക്ക് അറിയാവുന്ന പുല്ലാണെങ്കിലും നമ്മൾ അതിനെപ്പറ്റി എഴുതുമ്പോൾ നമ്മളതിനെ സ്ട്രെയിഞ്ച് ആക്കി എഴുതണം, എന്നാലേ ഒരു റീഡറിന് കിട്ടേണ്ട ആ ഒരു ഇമോഷണൽ അപ്പീൽ കിട്ടത്തുള്ളൂ എന്നാണ് വേർഡ്സ്വർത്ത് പറയുന്നത്. The primary laws of our nature as far as regards the manner in which we associate ideas in a state of excitement. And also he says that it is the poetry that should have to flow like a spontaneous flow of emotions, and this spontaneous flow of emotions in the language of the common man is after a certain kind of excitement. A certain kind of excitement is there, and that excitement makes the poet write about this. Now, when we go on to the views of Wordsworth, we see that he pleads for the retention of the common language in poetry. He says that common language of the common man is something that should be retained. He says that poetry should deal with the essential passions of the heart. The essential passions of the heart should be dealt with. Then he was of the view that the common man constantly communicates with the best part of the universe from which the best language originates. Why? A poet should take into consideration the common language of the common man. Why? Because the common man is a person who is always in association with nature and the beauty of nature. He communicates with the nature, and the best part of the universe is nature itself, from which the best language originates. So he says that the language of the common man is the best language possible to have in this world. Now he says about the characterization of a good poet. The characterization. What is the characterization of a good poet? A good poet is writing about a common man, of course, but he is not just another human being, but he is an uncommon man. He is superior to the common man in certain sense. In certain senses, he is superior, and therefore only he can write poetry. He can take subject matter from the common man, but he is somewhat superior from the common folk. Why? To write poetry. Then, he is not a presenter of facts, but gives immediate pleasure to the reader. He gives immediate pleasure to the reader. Then, writing poetry is not an intellectual activity, but a powerful and spontaneous overflow of emotions. So, what is the definition of poetry according to Wordsworth? The definition of poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Tranquility means a sort of excitement. Excitement വെച്ചിട്ട് ഉണ്ടാകുന്ന ഒരു spontaneous overflow of emotions ആണ് poetry. That is what Wordsworth says. So Wordsworth says that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful emotions. It takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Now, he says about the differences between a poetry and a prose. There is no difference. At first he says that the poetic composition as well as the prose composition will not have any difference in that sort of language, except that poetic composition will have some meter and rhythm, and this meter and rhythm intensifies the emotions and feelings by adding charm to it. So the charm of a poetic piece is on the meter and the rhythm that intensifies the emotions of the poem. Then Wordsworth inspired the use of ordinary subjects and ordinary language in poetry. He was the first critic to talk about poetic composition or language. You can see that before him also there was various critics, but these critics never talked about poetic composition or poetic language. So you can see that before him the ordinary language of the common man was taken as a rustic language. Okay, and this rustic language was condemned by the previous generations. They were saying that it was very futile, it was very bad language, and this rustic language was taken away, and instead of rustic language, the standard language to writing a composition was defined as poetic diction. ഇപ്പോൾ പോയറ്റിക് ഡിക്ഷൻ എന്ന് പറയുന്ന ഒരു പോയറ്റിക് സ്റ്റാൻഡേർഡ് ആയിട്ടുള്ള ലാംഗ്വേജ് അതിൻ്റെ ആവശ്യമില്ല എന്നാണ് വേർഡ്സ്വർത്ത് പറയുന്നത്. Because the language of the common man is the best language through which a poetry can find its emotional appeal to the reader. Then he aggressively defends his own creation in his critical piece. In his critical piece, he defends his views. He defends his views on the language of the poetry as well as the subject matter of the poem. Then, towards conclusion, you can see that literary criticism of Wordsworth was a manifesto of the British Romantic movement. It was the most vital element of the critical piece. Then, he views poetry as close to the religious insight in the life of things. He finds God in everything. That is what we heard about earlier. ഇന്നലെ നമ്മൾ പറഞ്ഞിരുന്നു, in romantic criticism, everybody, the romantic poets, they used to find God in the nature. In the same way, Wordsworth also found God in everything. His criticism is rich in suggestions and personal insights. So many personal insights are being given by him. He shifted emphasis from the reader to poem into the relationship between the poet and the poem. സോ റീഡർ പോയം ആയിട്ടുള്ള ഒരു കൈൻഡ് ഓഫ് റിലേഷൻ ആയിരുന്നു ഇതേവരെ നമ്മൾ കണ്ടിരുന്നത്. ബട്ട് ഹിയർ യു ക്യാൻ സീ ദാറ്റ് പോയറ്റും പോയമും തമ്മിലുള്ള ഒരു കണക്ഷനാണ് വേർഡ്സ്വർത്തിൻ്റെ റൊമാൻറ്റിക് ക്രിറ്റിസിസത്തിൻ്റെ അകത്ത് നമ്മൾ കാണുന്നത്. It is the poetic diction, the most important thing. The most important quote is poetry, about poetry. So you should have to study that. And with this, we come to an end of our class. And I feel that you all might have understood. In case of any discussion, please contact me.